If you've been watching the 244 build, you know there's some upgrades I've been talking about for a while, and this right here is a major hint of what we got coming in this episode. We've got more than $10,000 worth of upgrades to install. Some of them are gonna make the car drive better, and others are gonna make these episodes better. I'm excited for it. Let's dive into it. This one hurts to admit, but the 244 GTK has spent almost the entirety of its time since November of 2023 perched on this lift. Ignoring one unsuccessful trip to the dyno, it's been here waiting on one part or another ever since we blew an engine up at GTA Finals. It's been hiccup after hiccup and roadblock after roadblock, but finally this thing is ready to come off the lift, and if you missed it, in the last episode we installed a new K20 build from our friends at RS Machine. This new engine platform and build spec should yield a lot of reliability, and it's going to put us on the path towards getting this car out on track more in 2025 than ever before. Now, there are still some major plans in store for this car that I'm not quite able to reveal just yet, but let's just say this. There's a number of events on the docket that we want to make it to in 2025, and that includes a bit of a tour of the United States. Some of you Midwesterners and East Coasters are going to get to see this thing run in person. To prepare for that, we've got today's upgrades. Some of them are for your sake, while others are for ours, but let's just say I'm really excited about how this is going to change the car for the better in practically every way. So without further ado, let's dive into the first set of mods. Our friends at Shift Tech have sent us what might be, in my opinion, the coolest part of this entire thing so far. Like, this feels like some real race car stuff. We've got a complete air shift, paddle shift system for the 244. And as far as presentation goes, yeah, that feels like some race car parts. This is Shift Tech's Club Sport Sequential Paddle Shift Kit. And to fully understand what it is that it's supposed to do, well, let's break down the way that the car currently works by looking back at some race footage. The transmission in the 244 GTK is a sequential gearbox. It is a manual transmission, but instead of having an H pattern, the shifter is simply inline. It's shifted forwards and back to cycle through the gears a lot more like a motorcycle than a car. It's a dog engagement transmission as well, which means the clutch isn't used when you shift through the gears. It can be used on downshifts to rev match, but ultimately it's not necessary if everything is set up correctly. The clutch is only used to start and stop the car, and the benefit here is it makes for a very strong transmission that allows for very fast shifts, in some cases even without lifting up the throttle. The Shift Tech system that we have on hand and that we're about to install replaces the shift lever with an air-actuated solenoid. Now, to be clear, I'm still controlling the gears, but instead of using a lever attached to a cable to cycle the shift fork, we're going to use electronic switches to tell a servo to push forwards and back to do it for us. And that is going to make for much more reliable and much faster shifts. So here we've got our high pressure pump. This is what's going to keep an air supply so that we can always shift the transmission with air. We've got a very tiny little tank that's going to hold our air pressure. Make sure we've always got air on tap. We've got our paddle shifters. Oh man, oh, that's so sick. And then we've got this guy. This is really kind of the heart of the whole thing. This is the solenoid that's going to do the push-pull action of the shifting. And I think that means at this point, this will be the first time of probably many I actually explain how this thing works. A lot of people hear paddles and they immediately think, oh, it's not a manual anymore. There's no clutch. This is exactly the same transmission that's currently in there, and it uses the clutch just as much as it does now. It will send its air pressure and its electrical signal to activate this stuff, and will do the shift for us way faster and more accurately than we can do by hand. Simple as that. Hands never leave the wheel. We're gonna have nice, reliable shifts. It's going to make the transmission last longer. This is going to be an insane piece of technology to have in the car. It's going to make the driving experience on track that much better. I'm stoked. So we might as well start with the most interesting part of this install. And to begin it, I'm going to install this new Narita Dogfight steering wheel. And I know some of you are thinking right now, blue is not the right color choice for the car. However, there's a livery change coming soon, and this is going to make a lot more sense here in about a month. We're going to pair the new steering wheel with our old Battlecraft quick release, and then with that, we're going to need a backing plate that will support the paddle shifters. Now, I'm going to custom design one made out of carbon fiber, and I'm going to have it cut by our friends at Send Cut Send. But because I don't want to wait a week to get these parts installed, I called up Ryan over at Rywire, and he let me borrow a backing plate that he has with ShiftTech paddles already installed. Now, this backing plate also has some other buttons and switches that we won't be utilizing, so don't look too far into them, but otherwise this is a great example of what the finished product is going to look like. These paddle shifters are admittedly on the small side, and I might change them out for something bigger, but I think I want to try driving the car and seeing how they feel behind my fingers before I go messing with it. Other than that, this part of the install is largely complete. We'll have to add wiring in for the steering wheel on the steering column, but that's going to come later. I'll explain it at the end of the episode.
That sounds nice. Feels like a good distance from...
For anyone in the know, these are magnetic paddle shifters and they feel incredible. I'm excited to get to use these and see how it's actually going to perform.
Sick. Feels like a sim racer.
Obviously, they're not hooked up to anything yet. We've got to install the rest of the components, so that brings us to the compressor. Now, I spent a bit of time trying to figure out where exactly to mount this air compressor, and after mulling it over, I'm going to go here. I do want to put a passenger seat in this car at some point just so that friends can go for a lap with me. I'm going to have to relocate some stuff, but this should be safe here. It also gets it mounted really low, good center of gravity. It's still serviceable and should keep all of our plumbing to a minimum. So I put some riv nuts through the floor. We're just going to bolt it right down, and it should be pretty simple and straightforward. Surprisingly, I think that puts us at about halfway through the installation process already, so we're going to turn our attention over to the tank, which stores the volume of air for the shift system. This thing is a really sweet little tank with billet end caps and an onboard pressure sensor. It seems like ShiftTech really thought this thing through. Now, because it doesn't weigh anything, ShiftTech supplies a 3D printed mount for us to bolt it into the car, but instead of bolting it to a flat surface, I want to mount it to our roll bar. So I'm simply going to copy their clamp design, modify it a little bit, and add a provision for us to do exactly that. This thing printed in about an hour and a half, and with that, the mounting solution is finished. It goes right into the car as well. That's 3 components knocked out. As far as mounting location, I wanted to choose somewhere low down in the car for the center of gravity, and I wanted to keep our air lines short. That seems beneficial to the system, although I don't know that I can fully justify that because I'm not a fluid dynamicist. With these components in place, and since we know where the shift solenoid is going to go on top of the transmission, we can now turn our attention to the air lines. There's going to be 3 in total. The first is going to go from the compressor to the tank. The second will go from the tank to a bulkhead fitting on our rear firewall, and then the third will go from that bulkhead fitting to the shift solenoid. And to pull these lines off, ShiftTech does supply everything needed, but I decided to give Brennan over at Dime PSI a call so he could come over and make some for us. Of course, I want all of the plumbing to match on the car, but there's also a weight savings benefit given that the Dime PSI stuff is aramid braided and has a Teflon inner core versus a braided stainless line. Brendan used his rattlesnake kit in order to route all of the plumbing and figure out exactly how long and how to clock these lines. And I talked about that in a previous episode that I will link in the description if you want to learn more about it, because it's a really cool system that helps guys like you and me build some really impressive hoses. It helps that Brendan is able to come over to the shop to do the actual crimping, but this is a service that they provide to anyone who needs it. These are Dash 4 AN lines for anybody that's curious, and they have a burst strength of around 10,000 psi. So if you're concerned they're not going to hold up, trust me, they will. This system is quite low pressure in contrast to that. The final line, as said, runs from the bulkhead fitting on the firewall to the shift solenoid. We know where the solenoid's going to go because it has to bolt to the transmission itself, so Brendan took measurements and got to work making the last line. While he was busy with that though, I turned my attention to the next thing we're going to install, and that is a Vbox HD2 system from RaceLogic. This is, without question, the geekiest upgrade to the car so far, but I think it's going to radically transform our data acquisition and your viewing experience as we get this car out on track. To explain that, the HD2 system is both a data logging system and a video acquisition system. With this, we're going to tie into our Haltech Nexus R5, which will spit out all of the data from the car into this box. With that, we're also going to plug two cameras in, one to point inside the car and one to point outside. With all of that, we're going to be able to put together onboard video of our racing and competition efforts that overlays everything the car can tell us. It'll show us things like our position on the track thanks to a GPS system, it'll record audio, HD video, and all of the data from the car, so it'll tell you guys while you're watching things like RPM, speed, brake pressure, and more. I'm really excited about what this is going to do for us and for the channel, so let's get it installed. Now, one piece that I do have to solve is that the clamps for the roll bar for our Vbox mount are for 1 5/8 tubing. It's not quite going to work for our 1.5" tubing, so I 3D printed what hopefully should be some really simple little adapters. I'm going to find out if they fit. They should take up the slack between the tubing and the mount and allow us to just bolt the whole thing together. You can almost think of these adapters as rod bearings. I'm just going to slip them over the mounts to reduce the inner diameter and give this thing clamping force that it needs in order to bolt to the roll bar itself. Now let's talk about where I've decided to mount it. It is kind of high up in the car, but I want to make sure that it's really easily accessible. We're going to need to swap out the memory card with some frequency. I want to make sure that Anthony can do that without having to dive into the car or even open up the door. He can simply walk up to it and make sure that we are ready for the next session so that we've always got good video for you guys. As far as the video cameras, I've got one pointed loosely at the driver's position so you can see what my hands and feet are doing, and the other one is going to point out of the front of the car. We've got these on clamps and pivots so that we can adjust them as we get out on track and see how this stuff looks, but I think it's going to work pretty well. The next component I want to install is the GPS antenna. This thing needs a clear view of the sky and needs to be stuck to a metal surface, and thankfully we have a steel roof on the 308. So I'm simply going to mount it as close to the center as I can and then run the wire through the windshield frame instead of through the door so I don't have to worry about fatigue on the cable. From here, I just traced the wire around the roll cage and down to the Vbox itself and plugged it in. And then there's the RaceLogic OLED display, which is going to act as a lap timer or predictive timer. I want to mount it somewhere simple that I can see it, and my initial idea was to just mount it where our previous lap timer was, right below the CAN pad. Now, I don't know if this is a good idea, but I'm always a fan of trying to find the simplest solution that takes the least amount of time. And I'm realizing the back of this RAM mount that already mounts my CAN pad has a hole in the middle of it that looks like it would tap to 1/4-20. And then if I just put a 1/4-20 stud in it and add a hole to my mount, I'll just bolt right through it. I think it would work. I don't know why it wouldn't. I don't know how to clock it all correctly though. Maybe this isn't going to work. I thought I got smart for a second. I did not get smart for a second. Okay, back to the drawing board. This didn't work. All right, hold up. I've got it figured out. This is gonna work because if I use RaceLogic's original mount that allows me to kind of articulate things, this doesn't have a clock to it. I can use that to go onto the part and then mount it to this. It'll allow me to adjust everything, even though it doesn't really need it because that's what the RAM mount is for, but whatever. This will work, and then the only thing I'm gonna do after this before we actually go to the track is I'll replace this 3D printed part, even though it has been working well. We'll go in and cut it out of aluminum with Send Cut Send. Let's tap this. maybe. One thing that I don't have that would be nice at the moment is a blind quarter 20 tap. Let me show you about taps. So most people don't realize that, typically speaking, there's 3 kinds of taps for every thread. So here I've got 832, which if you're from anywhere but America, that sounds really stupid because it is. But we've got 3 taps. They're all the same size thread. The one most people are going to be familiar with is just like a normal tapered tap. And it starts cutting easily. It gets kind of into the hole and then starts cutting. But in our case, a blind tap that would be nice and handy is the same size all the way down to the end. And it allows us to tap holes all the way down inside of a hole that you can't get to the backside of or put a tap all the way through. The hole is blind. And then the other one is kind of a more aggressive tapered tap for kind of the opposite situation. So when I buy taps, I try to buy sets of all 3 so I don't run into this situation, but this is an SAE tap, and I don't buy SAE taps except for like the crappy universal set that I have, so whatever. It'll work. It'll be fine. Now, the mounting solution did work quite well, but the downside is that where it put the screen meant that I couldn't actually see it past the steering wheel. Even once we removed the shifter itself, it just wasn't fully visible and thus wasn't hugely useful. I played with some other ideas, such as mounting it on top of the dash, which made a lot of sense, but I had some fears that it would vibrate a lot here because it would be attached to a very thin aluminum panel. So I scrapped that idea and looked for something else. And then it clicked, I should try to mount it to the top of my steering column. But as it stands, that blocks part of my display, so we're gonna have to do something about that too. It's a bit of a snowball effect. My idea here, though, is to rob some parts from the F40. You see, Haltech sent us their new UC10, their gigantic digital display, and I think we should probably just take this opportunity to upgrade the 308. I mean, the F40's not going to need it anytime soon, right? This thing is massive in comparison and is going to give us a lot more information with one simple view. It's also got a lot of other impressive features that I'll touch upon in the next episode once we set it up, but thankfully, Haltech really thought this through and made sure that the mounting provisions are the same between the 2 dashes, so this is a bolt-on affair. We plugged it in, and it worked right away. This dash also has a lot more programmability to it, so we're going to get it all set up to display the information that we want later down the line. With the UC10 in place, now I'm going to drill some holes in the steering column itself, and then use a little aluminum mount to mount that OLED display. I tend to keep everything that I have laser cut, and some of the pieces left over, believe it or not, from our front splitter mount worked out perfectly for this. The holes were evenly spaced to mount to the steering column and to hold the display, so I just did a little bit of cleanup and then bolted it down. Simple as that. It was a 5-minute affair, and this problem was solved. The included pivoting mount allowed me to fine-tune the position, and I got it seated right on top of the steering column, exactly where I want it to be. I couldn't be happier with the outcome. And then, of course, our 3D printed dash mount has a pivot feature in it, so I brought it down into place, and now we have both displays right where we want them, without either one covering the other. All that was left was to wire in the OLED display, and we can call the race logic install done, minus interfacing it with the ECU and applying power. And we're going to do that in the next episode once we get out our wiring supplies. As a final nerdy detail, any of my sim racing fans out there can probably agree or share the sentiment of how cool it is to see this display in my own car. Now, let's get back to the ShiftTech install. The transmission is currently shifted by a lever and cables. We're not going to be using these anymore, they need to come out, so it's time to rip everything out and start from square one. Some of you may have seen sequentially shifted cars that use paddle shifters and still have the lever in place, but the way my car is set up, that's not an option, so we're going to pull it all out and just appreciate the fact that we can save the weight. This shifter was really cool, it functioned perfectly, and I'm going to miss it a little bit, but the idea of paddle shifting this car is 10 times more appealing. Now with the shift cable out of the way, we can finally figure out how we're going to mount the shift solenoid. And the way that it works is this end is going to attach to the shift fork, and we need to make a mount that supports this one so it kind of free floats in space. And that's because the shift fork moves on an arc, and so it kind of needs to be able to pivot as it moves. What I'm thinking realistically is I'm probably gonna cut up the cable mount itself, or maybe not even cut up, but at least weld to it and see if I can just modify what's already there, because it's really, really close to being right where it needs to be. It already bolts to the transmission, and I don't see why we should try to like reinvent the wheel here. Now, this cable mount was never really intended to do anything like this. It was clearly designed to serve a single purpose, but I think with some creativity, we can come up with an alternative. And thankfully, I have more of that same scrap that I used to mount the OLED display from the RaceLogic system. It's aluminum, as is the cable mount, and it's already got 8mm holes in it, and this works perfectly given the rod end size on the shift selector. By cutting some slots in this material and whipping out the welder, I think we could affix all of this together and have a relatively simple solution that we can knock out in give or take an hour. Is it the most beautiful thing? No, but I don't think that that part matters. This could also just serve as a proof of concept that we could go back and change later, but we'll just find out how it works. I guess it works, I don't know. We'll weld it up, shape the end. Hopefully this isn't too oil impregnated to weld. Here's the secret, I don't know what I'm doing. I never do. But it looks like it'll work. Then I just gotta stack some washers or make some spacers to go in here to kind of support it, because the rod end is not that wide. But this gives us structure. Whatever. So after a little bit of fiddling with it to make sure that it's actually square and true, I whipped out the torch to make sure that it was nice and hot before welding, because this is a hefty chunk of aluminum. You probably noticed that there are 2 sets of holes on this thing, and in an ideal world, I can use the lower set of holes and trim the top one off, but I might need the extra height to clear the solenoid body, so we're going to leave both on for the time being, get everything installed, and make sure that it functions. Now, one final fear that I have is that this is aluminum, and by welding it, I'm annealing it. Welded aluminum can get quite soft, and there's a lot of pressure on this shift solenoid, so hopefully it doesn't bend, but I think that it should be okay because, as said, this is a pretty hefty chunk of metal. I got it bolted into the car, everything lines up the way that it should, and I think it's going to work. I'm excited about it. I've got to machine a small adapter to get everything fully bolted in, and then this is done. Now that should be everything that we need physically for this new shift setup. Minus, we've got to put one final air line on. I'm waiting on a bulkhead fitting to show up just to kind of simplify some of the plumbing instead of actually running a hose through the firewall. But other than that, all that's left is to hook up this harness that Shift Tech actually supplies with this thing, and it's a really nice harness. The whole thing is ray chemmed and booted. It's a motorsport grade harness. It's quite cool. It's gonna make installation really easy. Could we go on and hook it all up? Yes, except for one thing, and we need to interface this with our Haltech Nexus R5, and I'm waiting on a plug to do that and some help from Andrew and Ryan at Rywire to make sure that I interface it correctly, because all of the inputs that we're doing need to kind of talk to the computer and tell it when to cut throttle and when to, open the throttle body, close the throttle body. It's going to do rev matching, things like that. So it's a complicated setup. We got to get it all working correctly, and I got to make sure that the wiring side of it works. So this is going to happen in the next episode, because the next episode for this thing, we're going to fix that water neck. We're going to get the rest of this stuff wired in. We're going to get over to the dyno. We're going to dyno this new RS Machine engine and have this thing fully set up for this Shift Tech system. We are going to have this car drivable. We'll rip it up the street, make sure it's all happy, and then it's off to the track to get to testing. Finally, it has been a long road coming. This feels like a bunch of progress in this episode. I'm really happy about it. Honestly, this is a ton of changes that I'm really excited about. I'm excited to drive this car big time, from the engine to the shift setup to being able to video this stuff on track and supply you guys with so much better of a viewing experience. It's going to be cool bottom to top. So hope you guys are excited for it. This episode has been a long time coming. The car's going to head out on track soon. I got the pedal down for it. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't. Thank you guys as always for watching, and we'll catch you guys in the next 308 episode.